Marta's story was more than just a village legend. It was a whispered warning, passed down from generation to generation. Those who heard it could not escape its weight, as if the shadows of buried secrets came to life, lingering over each word. Marta, a young woman with bright, passionate eyes, yearned intensely for Ferran's love, a desire that drove her to cross dark, unknown boundaries. When I heard her story, I imagined the intensity of her determination, how her longing to be loved had made her a prisoner of her own obsession. They say she discovered there was a woman in the village, a woman of sorcery who, for a small sum, could grant her the promise of eternal love. At first, no one knew exactly how Marta managed to endure the rituals or ignore the weight of the old woman's warnings. Binding spells are deadly where there is no true love, the woman had warned her. Yet Marta, blinded by her illusion of a happy ending, sealed the pact. Everyone knew of the ominous reputation of such magic, but Marta pressed on, convinced her passion was enough to defy any consequences. However, fate proved to be cruel. What seemed like victory transformed into a slow, silent tragedy. Marta watched helplessly as the man of her dreams became a shadow, a ghost without memories, trapped in a body that emptied day by day of everything that once made him vibrant and human. What remained for her was only guilt and solitude. At Ferran's funeral, Marta understood she had lost more than just a love. She had lost herself. On that dark night, when the mourning subsided and Marta was left alone in her empty home, she felt a presence invade her space. Like an apparition, her Aunt Valentina approached, a figure cloaked in shadows who knew better than anyone the weight of regrets borne by the women in our family. Valentina looked at her with the calm of someone who had endured similar torments, and in a quiet voice, invited Marta to seek refuge in the House of Widows, a place where other women, bitter and consumed by the past, tried to atone for their sorrows. Marta accepted, knowing that perhaps it was her last chance at redemption, or at least some comfort for her wounded soul. As I recounted this story, I could see my cousin's eyes fixed on me, absorbed by the mystery and subtle horror of each detail. Even those who already knew the story seemed to feel something new, as though the legend took on a deeper life in the dim light of that room. In the silence, I felt as though Aunt Valentina's presence surrounded us, watching from the shadows, the keeper of secrets we had unwittingly unearthed. Are you listening? Sometimes we encounter stories like this, stories that undoubtedly shift our perspectives. It's happened to you, hasn't it? This might be the story that finally sends a shiver down your spine, that makes you feel as though anything is possible. I have to confess, community, that even with my skepticism, or what remains of it, there are stories that read differently, that narrate themselves in a unique way, that create a distinct, almost tangible atmosphere here in my home. In this small makeshift studio, surrounded by horror books, shadows, and objects that perhaps carry their own energy. These are the stories that leave an imprint in the air, a strange vibration, something you can feel even when silence fills the space. I hope you're ready to listen, because it's time to dive into this experience, this tale of the night. Few people like going to that house. We knew it belonged to the family, and from time to time a relative would use it, but only in an emergency, when there was truly no other option. Even then, no matter the circumstances, few had the courage to spend an entire night in that mansion. To give you an idea, only Uncle Lalo, a man of unquestionable courage, slept there once. And even he, who would face any situation without hesitation, did not wish to repeat the experience. Uncle Lalo was a soldier. He was a robust, fearless man who was not easily shaken. I remember one night when he left home to protect some cousins who were being pursued by a gang. He left his beer on the table, picked up a wrench, and walked out without a word. The gang knew who they were dealing with, and just seeing him approach was enough to make them scatter. That was the kind of person Lalo was. So imagine what must have happened in that house to frighten him so much. A man that fearless, who refused to return, leaving the place shrouded in an aura of mystery and dread. The mansion was known as the House of Widows, and that name wasn't just a nickname. At one point, it served as a refuge for all the women in the family who, almost as if by some curse, became widows while still young. It was said that these women were always welcomed by Aunt Valentina, the first widow in the lineage, a stern woman who transformed that mansion into a kind of convent, a place where her guests lived in perpetual mourning, dedicating their lives to prayer and silence. It was a secluded life, with no allowance for friendships, no outside bonds, living only in mourning and constant prayer. Practically a convent, only with less freedom and more severity. And you may wonder, why would anyone accept to live under such rules? Well, the answer is simple, and perhaps frighteningly practical. Aunt Valentina possessed an impressive fortune, enough money to support a tranquil existence, to keep the mansion intact, and to provide a generous allowance to each of the widows, enough to sustain them, and in some cases, even their children who were left outside. The mansion, with its silent corridors and dark rooms, exuded an atmosphere of sadness. There was something about that place that made the stories of those women seep into the walls, as though forgotten laughter, hidden tears, and years of silence had been absorbed by the very structure of the house. Some said that at nightfall, it was possible to hear murmuring voices, as if the former residents still wandered there, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and regret. Personally, I never believed in the supernatural. Well, I hadn't, until I heard the story of the House of Widows. I always attributed the accounts to collective suggestion, a kind of family hysteria, where fear spread and created genuine sensations. And I thought perhaps the house only held an intense emotional weight, a sadness that influenced whoever passed through. But when I heard about Aunt Valentina and her convent of widows, I began to understand that the place held a unique energy. Aunt Valentina didn't just shelter the widows. She imposed on them a life of devotion, mourning, and absolute isolation. They rarely left the house, and strict rules prevented them from forming bonds with anyone. It was as though the house was a sanctuary for lost souls, living with a single purpose: to mourn their losses, and perhaps seek some form of redemption. And what happens in a place like that, where stories of pain, regret, and dark secrets accumulate for generations? Maybe that's why the house feels alive, or almost so. It's as if those who enter there become part of something larger, as though they're swallowed by this collective sadness. I'm talking about many decades ago, when women in places like this didn't know how to work, and when widowed felt as though the world had ended. But aside from giving this context, which I believe is important, let me tell you about the time I spent a night in that house. The reason I delved into this story, about the House of Widows, of my family. Today, the house has been unoccupied since Aunt Valentina's death in 1984, 40 years ago. Due to the will, the house cannot be sold until 50 years have passed since her death, and the remaining money was used for its upkeep. Aunt's eccentricities, but that's what's stipulated. But as I said, the house served as a meeting point, a place to stay overnight only in cases of extreme urgency. I never fully understood why no one had moved in. I thought it was more because of family disputes, because the house belonged to everyone and no one, than because of genuine fear. When my cousins and I were in high school, something we had never done in another school, Aunt Valentina's house, the House of Widows, became our favorite place to spend the afternoons. It was less than a kilometer from school, so it was common for us to go there to do homework, and I confess also to throw parties when we decided to skip class. It was in that house that I had my first beer, got drunk for the first time, threw up from drinking too much for the first time. But always during the afternoon, before dark. It was on one of those afternoons that my cousin Viridiana, my cousin Mariano and I stayed talking later than usual, until night fell. It was the first time we openly discussed the curiosity we felt about the whole family's fear of that house. Viridiana told us it was because it was full of ghosts, that the widows had never left, and that their vow to spend the rest of their lives there didn't just refer to their earthly physical lives, but that their spirits would continue to inhabit it until there was nothing left of it. Marta knew she couldn't compete with her. The woman who had captured Ferran's heart seemed to have everything Marta felt she lacked. Beauty, charisma, an aura that drew looks and sighs. Desperate, she heard of a woman who lived on the outskirts of the village and who, for a few pesos, performed binding spells and enchantments promising to conquer any heart. Marta was willing to risk everything to have Ferran by her side, and the desire to defeat her rival consumed her to the point of ignoring any cost. She sought out the woman, an elderly, mysterious figure whose home exuded the aroma of dried herbs and burning incense, and sealed the pact without hesitation. The woman handed her an envelope filled with herbs of strong, unpleasant odor, and explained that they were to be dissolved in a tea that Ferran would need to drink. She warned her, however, that binding spells served to intensify feelings, but could be deadly if love had never been true. Marta ignored the warning, convinced that their evening conversations, the caresses, and that kiss at dusk were proof that at some point Ferran had loved her, even if silently. Driven by determination, she carefully planned the night she would make Ferran drink the tea. Taking advantage of his mother's goodwill, she offered to prepare something for when he returned, tired from the studio. She prepared a full dinner, meticulously attended to every detail, and left the tea aside, disguised among other drinks. Feigning, however, a strong stomach ache, she withdrew before he arrived, asking his mother to serve the meal. As she had foreseen, Ferran ate dinner and unsuspectingly drank the tea to the last drop. The next morning, Ferran appeared at her door with a gleam in his eye. He confessed his love as if a dam had burst. He said he had never realized how much he loved her before, but now the feeling was exploding, uncontrollable. They dated for a short time, and 2 months later, they got married. Marta was the happiest and proudest woman in the village, feeling that she had finally won her battle. But as the days passed, something dark began to manifest in Ferran. His once vibrant gaze seemed lost and confused, and he started to utter disjointed words, as if struggling to form complete sentences. His fingers, once skilled in the workshop, now hesitated, trembled, unable to create anything cohesive. Gradually he stopped speaking, and even the simplest gestures began to require tremendous effort. He lost the ability to walk on his own, and before long, could no longer get out of bed. Marta had to start working to support him. and the couple eventually returned to Ferran's mother's house, where she became his constant caregiver, looking after him as if he were a helpless child. Increasingly, Marta felt the weight of regret growing, especially on nights when exhaustion led her to think the unthinkable. One night, returning home from work exhausted, with a bundle of fresh bread, she looked at Ferran and, in a fleeting and painful moment, wished that he could rest. She was immediately horrified by the thought, as if something monstrous were taking shape within her. Amidst the whirlwind of regret and guilt that suffocated her, Marta decided to nurture one last hope. She believed, with the little faith she had left, that love might be able to heal Ferran, to restore what had been lost in the shadows. She clung to the memory of the moments when he still smiled at her and looked at her with affection, as if she could somehow revive the man who once made her dream. However, when she opened the door to the house that afternoon, she was met with a scene that took her breath away. Neighbors were supporting Ferran's mother, her face marked by despair and a sadness so profound it seemed to age her by decades. The woman was sobbing, trembling, as her empty eyes fixed on Ferran's body, so pale and fragile that he resembled a shadow of the young man he once was. The silence of that moment, broken only by the horrified whispers of the neighbors, weighed heavily like a condemnation. Marta knew even before someone told her what had happened. Overcome by pain and believing she saw in her son's eyes a plea for liberation, Ferran's mother had approached him the night before with a pillow in hand. She suffocated him, putting an end to the suffering that was slowly consuming him, freeing him from the torment to which Marta had unknowingly condemned him. Marta froze before the scene, unable to process what she saw. Ferran's body, once strong and full of life, had been reduced to a motionless figure, so fragile and small that it almost disappeared amidst the mourning. On the night following Ferran's burial, Marta was alone in her dark house, engulfed by a darkness that seemed to grow with each passing second. Every corner of the house whispered memories, and she, lost between tears and recollections, felt crushed by the emptiness. It was as if a dense gloom covered all the objects around her, distorting their shapes, erasing what had once made sense. Suddenly she felt a strange and subtle presence invading the house. Only when she heard soft, slow footsteps did she realize she was no longer alone. It was her Aunt Valentina, appearing from the shadows like a ghost. Dressed in black, with a veil partially covering her face, she brought with her an aura of mystery and weight, as if she carried the torments of all the women who had crossed her path. Aunt Valentina's figure seemed dark, yet, at the same time, welcoming. A contrast that made Marta feel a mix of relief and apprehension. Valentina stopped in front of her, with the serene expression of someone who had faced all possible tragedies. Her voice, low and resolute, broke the silence, inviting Marta to go to the House of Widows, a place where women like her, torn by suffering and consumed by regret, sought understanding, trying to find a way to atone. As I told this story, I noticed how absorbed my cousins were in the narrative. Some already knew the legend of Marta and Ferran, but still seemed unable to escape the dark enchantment it provoked. Each version, with each generation, gained new nuances, heavier and darker, as if the tale had a life of its own, shaping itself over the years. The atmosphere in our home grew denser, and the air seemed to carry an invisible, almost tangible presence. The silence was so profound that every sound echoed like a scream. Each time we looked at the staircase leading to the second floor, we felt a strange sensation, a chill running down our spines, as if at any moment Aunt Valentina's figure might descend to confront us, demanding to know why we were there, telling stories that perhaps should remain buried. Then an unexpected sound broke the silence. We heard footsteps, soft, distant steps, with a rhythmic and mysterious cadence. We didn't know where they were coming from, whether from upstairs or some point on the street, but the sound was undeniable, sending a chill spreading among us. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind, an uncomfortable coincidence. But deep down, we all knew something inexplicable was happening. Shortly after the footsteps, the silence was replaced by a subtle, continuous sound, a low and uninterrupted scratching that seemed to come from the walls, as if someone or something were trying to cross the space between us. Each of us shrank back, immobilized by uncertainty, trying to discern whether it was real or just a macabre creation of our minds. Aunt Valentina's presence seemed to fill every corner of the house, as if she was still lurking, a vigilant guardian of the secrets we had inadvertently brought to the surface on that night of tales and fears.